I'm going to draw quite a bit of a recent book that just came out, edited by me and another colleague, called The New Cold War and the Remaking of Regions. Now, I think some of the chapters are actually quite interesting, especially one on China by a colleague from Singapore. So, as we all know, the arrival of the Trump administration has really regenerated the idea of let's say, neo-imperialism, neo-mercantilism, and attached to that is the disruption to the liberal international order that has been in existence since end of World War II, and the trading system that undergird this order. And so what you're finding is a new form of rivalry re-emerging among the great powers. And this is, some people are uncomfortable to call it Cold War, but anytime the war is not hot, there may be variations across the range of conflict issues. But clearly there is something is happening with respect to the transition that we are experiencing. But I think it's an uncertain period. And historically, there are many periods like this before the next round of competition emerges. One thing is clear, we call this, drawing a little bit from Amitabh Acharya's idea, multiplexity, but I think it is more than multiplex. It is indeed a hybrid form of order that is multiplex plus multipolar to a great extent. So my first point is that this nature of this order will remain like this until the gap between the two leading powers, United States and China, versus the rest is about 30 to 40% of the world's economic and military power structure. So it is a period of transition. And clearly the first period of first Cold War, was characterized by extensive amount of competition. And, I don't need to repeat. There was containment, there was complete cutting off, but proxy wars in the world's theaters of the world. This new Cold War is very diffused. The ideological dividing lines are no longer clear-cut. Ideology still matters. It is not into two camps. Indeed, it's intramural. Within the Western liberal order seems to have the biggest ideological contestation. One point I clearly submit here is that the second-ranking and third-ranking actors do have a lot more agency today than during the First Cold War, which gives us some hope, despite the bleakness of the situation, that it is not going to be as bad as perhaps the First Cold War. Cross-cutting institutional structures exist today. You have G20, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that means, as well as Quad to some extent, there is an opportunity for different actors to engage each other. So those who study democratic theory, Robert Dahl's idea of cross-cutting cleavages, can apply that to this context of international order. And the fact that China is not revisionist yet to the extent of its historical nature of a rising power, indeed, more revisionism is coming from the established power at this point. So it is a sort of opportunity that gives the second-ranking powers a form of engagement as well as benefiting to some extent. So it is a multipolar, multiplex Cold War in the sense that countries are playing the game as much they can, of course, with their own limitations. So what we are witnessing is the three principal powers, United States, Russia, and China, are trying to bring back the norm of spheres of influence. And that is what great powers are known for. And the other norm, opposite to that, sovereign equality and territorial integrity, that's what the norm most of the rest of the world really want. And that is being contested. This contestation is historic. In fact, if you go back the concept of Europe system onwards, the great powers try to concentrate power in their hands. That's why in the concert there were only 5 powers. The rest of the world had no voice. Slight improvement in the League Versailles system, a few more powers added. But it was in San Francisco, the Potsdam system changed to San Francisco. You find 50 states or so participating in the formation of the United Nations and creating the two-tier system. You have the General Assembly giving spheres of influence and great power status a particular role, but then you have the General Assembly accepting sovereign equality as the other norm. So when great powers push for this sphere of influence norm, it really creates a lot of challenges for those who are on the periphery, on the cutting edge of those dividing lines. So Ukraine happened to be in the wrong place. And so that those states have to be careful how they play. They're coming to Trump. So all the three are seeking what he calls spheres of influence norm. And that is a big challenge for international order. The American foreign policy, as you know, underwent dramatic change in the most recent national security document, indeed, came after I wrote this paper. But I think it sort of reinforces some of my argument. Here you have a disruptor in many ways. Usually it's a rising power that is disruptor of international order. Here, actually, it's the established power and fearing decline. So MAGA is not simply a domestic project. MAGA is an international project faced by the fear of decline. And that decline is not actually captured well in the discourse on this subject, which really is problematic because it's mostly about domestic debate. And I blame the comparative politics people for not bringing in the international forces behind it. The document really talks about creating a new great power condominium, which I predict will fail. Let me be bold here. The reason being, it's expecting reciprocity from the other two. And the other two are not going to play this game according to American interests or American concepts. They may play along like the Tan period in the 1970s, but they have their own strategy. They want to outmaneuver the United States, and that is a big problem. The second problem is this document doesn't mention the word crisis. International politics often is driven by crises, which are not pre-planned. Okay, Ukraine war was not pre-planned. It happened. And it happened because they all have their own grand strategies. So the non-great power states have a little bit, so the Trump policy assumes restraint on the part of Russia and China. What if not, they don't restrain according to Trump's idea? And that, I think, is a big question mark for everyone concerned. The secondary states are indeed historically played a significant role if they could. And that is very clear during the First Cold War. So today, the regional order is in transition. It is clearly going through many changes. But 3 points I would emphasize. First, the great power-led alliances are harder to form, except that pre-existing like Korea or Japan. Rising powers have little incentive to bandwagon unless directly threatened by another power. China has pursued hegemony through indirect gray zone means, absent large-scale overt aggression, and hence many states have no reason to join anti-China military alliance, which is a big difference from European era, industrial era great powers. The second, economic interdependence remains high despite the reduced US-China interdependence. Many states rely heavily on Chinese markets and supply chains. Even though it is weaponized by both sides, it is still going to continue. Third, non-great power agency has expanded. Economic growth and globalization have strengthened the bargaining power of pivotal states, especially the second-ranking states. Despite some deglobalization, many pursue strategic autonomy with notable success. So the world is polycentric. We could see a bi-multipolarity emerging if China and the US continue to make more advances. But by 2030, India, Indonesia, and Brazil are projected to surpass several Western economies. India has overtaken UK in 2022, and this has implications. Finally, what are the implications for the Korean Peninsula? The Korean Peninsula sits at the intersection of competing great power interests and remains highly vulnerable to external intervention. So South Korea in particular faces what you call entrapment and abandonment risks. within its alliance with the United States. But China's rise introduces additional strategic challenges, clearly giving Seoul opportunities too, unlike in the past, where there was no point in interacting with the Soviet Union or China. So I think the clear message here is how to enlarge your capacity to play the game carefully without really falling into the trap of this great power conflict that indeed is a trap. And I think here is also the problem of how much you can rely on this alliance, but the alliance is still needed. I'm pretty much clear about that. But the economic interdependence with China is potentially useful to mitigate possibility for abandonment. Achieving a non-nuclear North Korea appears unlikely without peaceful reunification. Pyongyang views nuclear weapons as essential to regime survival. So here, regime deterrence, regime survival versus national deterrence or country's deterrence is conflated. For them, the regime is the country. And so that is the biggest challenge you're facing. So confidence building measures may be the first route to go. I would work on the idea of non-use, nuclear non-use, and clearly deterrence has to be emboldened with other mechanisms, including reassurance. So there is a big difference between historical case of denuclearization. I have written about the subject. South Africa, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus are the cases that occurred under unique circumstances. And here they don't offer you much guidance. Ukraine's experience in particular has likely reinforced North Korea's skepticism toward the so-called security guarantees. Given these realities, denuclearization is unlikely without regime change, which currently appears remote. And so priority should be instead focused on crisis prevention, arms control-oriented confidence building, freezing nuclear and missile development, exploring measures such as no first-use commitment, and de-alerting arrangements. So comparative insights from South Asia also demonstrate the difficulty of building nuclear confidence among active, enduring rivals. Pakistan, as the weaker state, relies heavily on asymmetric strategies under its nuclear umbrella, while India has increasingly challenged this behavior. The Korean Peninsula must avoid similar dynamics by pursuing step-by-step CBMs. For instance, hotlines, crisis stability measures, military exchanges, incremental arms control. So there is this argument now, I think quite a bit loud. South Korea, Germany, or Japan should acquire nuclear weapons to enhance stability. But I argue that proliferation would severely weaken the global non-proliferation regime and risking major crisis, at least the initial phase of nuclearization, as happened in the Indian subcontinent. If you may recall the Kargil War as a direct result of the nuclearization. China would strongly oppose Japanese and South Korean nuclearization, which could undermine its regional military advantage. China does not want to see a peer nation with nuclear weapons because it's a great equalizer when it comes to strategic engagement. Nuclear weapons do offer existential security. They are no guarantee for avoiding stability-instability paradox. So stability-instability paradox will get worsen in this context. So we need to think about the cost-benefit calculations of nuclearization. So let me stop there. We need to think about multilateral peace process, including Korea's, China, and the United States, because these actors are intertwined in this process. And the best strategy at this point is to avoid this Cold War coming into this peninsula and becoming pawns of the great power game. So agency, keep it up as much you can. Strategic autonomy, keep it up as much you can. All the best.